Hi, well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I am Tamara Ecker, Managing Director of British American Business, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to part one of our BAB Accelerate workshop for US inbound companies. For those of you who may not be familiar with BAB, we are the trade association exclusively supporting businesses operations both in the US and the UK. And while we work with many of the largest multinational firms competing board level roundtable discussions and curating content, we are also tenacious advocates for the SME growth businesses looking to invest and expand both in the UK and US markets. It is our role as the only organization solely focused on these markets to facilitate and champion businesses looking to expand. We do that in a number of different ways through publications, through events, and through one-to-one support. If you would like to connect with us, my team is going to put their contact information in the chat and you can follow up with them after the session. So with that said, and before we do jump into the session, just a few house rules. We encourage you to keep your cameras on so that you can interact with our presenters and fellow attendees, but please keep your microphones on mute unless you are asking a question. And we do encourage questions, so please either raise your virtual hand or make a note in the chat and we will come to you. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first session, which is how to make a splash across the pond, top tips for brand experts on marketing your business in the US. And there really is no firm better position to lead this session than BrandPie. BrandPie has offices both in London and New York. They were founded in 2008, and they help companies discover, activate, and illuminate their purpose, unlocking growth and building a sustainable future for their businesses. Their client roster includes companies like EY and Mars, Oatly, Capgemini, just to name a few. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Mary Lee Sachs, US CEO of BrandPie, and Rick Haslam, Executive Creative Partner at BrandPie, to take us through the session. So Mary Lee and Rick, over to you.
Thanks, Tamara. While I'm getting the presentation up, it's worth me just saying that the leadership of BrandPie actually have, can you everybody see that, hopefully?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Hello. And I'm just going to put it on slideshow there. Okay. It's worth me mentioning that the leadership of BrandPie have worked, all of us have worked on both sides of the pond. So I like to think that we bring a practical experience to this, this little session. And we're going to take you through a few things, but we're going to try and do it very quickly so that there's lots of time at the end for questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the US marketing landscape and some of the biggest differences between the UK and the US. And then I'm going to talk about how best to establish or how best to be thinking about establishing a presence. So one is from the external perspective, as in what's happening out there that you need to be aware of. And the other one is from the internal perspective, what you should be doing to prepare yourself to come into the US market. And then I'm going to hand over to Rick, who's going to talk a little bit about our ethos and approach and how we have activated it for clients. So with that, very quickly, who we are, because if you haven't heard of BrandPie, there's just a slide on our vital statistics, I like to call it. We were formed in 2008. I opened the New York office in 2014. We work for a variety of clients, as Tamara mentioned, both from a very large
Marilee, I think
you've gone on mute for some reason. I think just unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah.
That just happened, or did you not hear anything I just said?
No, we heard you just the last
roll back about 10 seconds.
Okay. I was just saying that we work for a wide range of clients, from the very large like EY all the way through to startups and SMEs. So we have a lot of experience across the board. And we're award winning. And I think from the point of view of people maybe coming in from the UK is that we've been acknowledged by the FT for several years for being a leading consulting firm. So I thought I would just mention that. So enough about us. Let's just have a think about what the US marketing landscape is like. And honestly, I could spend at least an hour on each one of these four areas. It's so complex, it's so different, and yet it's it's undeniably seems very similar given that we speak kind of the same language, almost the same language. For those of you who travel frequently to the US, it's a little bit different when you live here. You probably think if you come here often enough, you kind of know the US, and if you know New York, you must know that New York is not like the rest of the US. So we're going to just try and give you an overview of each one of these buckets in a very quick period of time. So as you know, it's a vast marketplace. The GDP in the UK is nearly 2.5 trillion. In the US, it's over 15 trillion, 6 times more than the UK. So the scope of the market is huge. If you come into the US and you come into New York specifically, you have to start thinking about the different states. And each state has its own legislation. So in a way, it's kind of like the EU, but it's not like the EU. But every state has its own legal framework. And you need to be aware of that, because if you hire people, and I'm sure that you'll get into this in some of the other workshops, if you hire people, you need to be aware of what you can and cannot do. We are generally speaking 3 time zones in difference. But that said, there's actually 12 time zones if you take Alaska and Hawaii into account. So it's a vast marketplace. It's a hugely different media landscape too. I mean, we have some of the same things that you have in the UK, but we're talking scale and scope. The most extreme example, of course, is the price of airtime during the Super Bowl. A 30-second slot in 2021 cost 5.5 million. Whereas ITV got up to £750,000 for a 30-second advert during England's Euro 2020 semifinal. So that just kind of gives you a sense of cost of media if you're thinking about advertising. And that's an extreme example, obviously. Add to that the nuance in the US around what we would call tentpole media events, which are much more pronounced here in the US than they are in the UK. So this means any event that your customers and prospective customers identify with and rally around in some way. So your job as a marketer is to leverage those tentpole events, which are relevant to your business, in a way to drive awareness and marketing goals for your business. So for example, there's the big ones like Black Friday, spring break, back to school, but Americans are well known for making up all sorts of things, which you probably already know. So you might not know that October also is National Breast Cancer Month. It is also Adopt a Dog Month. It's National Cheese Month. It's Sarcastic Month. Yeah, Sarcastic Month. I have no idea what that is, but it is Sarcastic Month. So you can kind of start to get a sense of all the things that are going on in the market, and equally all the things that you might want to tap into when you're thinking about your own marketing. Customer segmentation. I think from looking at the list of people that are on this call that a lot of you operate in the B2B space. I'm sure there's some B2C here as well, but this is just a quote from somebody who came into the US a couple of years ago. You know, a $1 to $10 billion business in the UK would be large. In the USA, it's very much a mid-sized business. Know your market. It's a bigger market. So in the UK, it's very easy to identify companies that you can work for. For example, in the UK, you might focus on the FTSE 100. In the US, you need to be much more focused in your approach to targeting because the list is so much longer. There are so many B2B companies of size that you've never even heard of. And capital structures are different. There's a lot more PE and VC-backed firms that are increasingly depending on the firms they've invested in to have a strong purpose and brand. So it's really important if you want to attract investment in this market to be strong in your brand as well. And finally, in terms of sort of the external factors that you might be considering, you know, there's a huge landscape of political and cultural sensitivities and differences to the UK. The US is a bit of a market of conundrums. Americans are significantly more racially and ethnically diverse than Britons, and a greater proportion of them were born in other countries. So consider cities where Spanish is spoken as much as, if not more than, English, places like Miami, El Paso, Texas, and other border cities. And yet passport ownership is so much lower. 33% of Americans own passports versus Britain's 82%. So whilst you have a really big melting pot of nationalities, they don't necessarily travel. Diversity and inclusion is massively different. It's much more advanced here and really important to build into your thinking. And as I said earlier, if your experience in the US is mainly New York based, please know that the rest of the US is like another country. New York is a special market. So, but so are places like California. And I'm going to shout out, that's my home state. Shout out to my home state. If California were a sovereign nation, it would rank as the world's 5th largest economy, ahead of India and just behind Germany. So again, another big important difference. And it's really, really important to build your network and leverage that. Somebody else who moved into the US from the UK said, I found a big difference in how helpful US business people are. When they say they'll introduce you to somebody, they do it. In the UK, people say it, but often don't follow through. The culture of helping each other is much more firmly established here. So if you offer to help somebody, make sure you do it. And I think this is a shout out to British American business because it's a great place to do some of that networking. And there are probably other verticals that you might want to think about as networking opportunities. So very quickly, enough about the external factors. How does this factor into how you're thinking about coming into the country? I think it's a balance of thinking about what works for you in the UK and what's transferable over here in the US. So you have to have an overarching purpose, ambition, strategy, positioning, brand values, etc. Whatever your raison d'etre is in the UK, it needs to be transferable to the US. And then there will be some things that you do in the UK that transfer across borders, but equally there'll be some things that don't at all. And you're going to need to think about things that will actually work in this market that might be a little bit different, but still true to your brand. And that box at the bottom is really just about understanding what's going on in the market and being able to kind of transfer what you have in the UK that works to what might work in the US. Another linear way of looking at this is do your homework. So do a lot of market research, look at the competitive landscape, your peer landscape, your target customers, the reach that you want to have when you come into the US, and then cross-tabulate that with your experience in the UK, with what you know or what you think will work in the US. Think about the things that you do already that are going to bleed into the US, like your web channels, your social media channels, and make sure that you accommodate a US voice in those channels because there is no border when you go to digital, and determine what new things you need to put into place. And then it's really just about rinsing and repeating. You just want to make sure that you're continually learning, continually listening to the marketplace, and really trying to understand what's going on and what's working best. So that was a really quick run through of things that you might want to kind of keep in mind. I'm going to hand over now to Rick, my business partner, who's going to talk a little bit about how we approach the business.
Okay, so Marley, if you could flip forward a couple of slides for me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the brand pie ethos in the context of businesses moving from the UK to the US. Forward one slide, please, Marley. You've heard that the US has a very strong focus on the purpose story within organizations. And of course, purpose is something all organizations globally are focusing on. But just like D&I and issues like that, it's a little bit more extreme in the US. So you really need to be sure and confident that your purpose story is strong and will resonate here. This is the work that Brand Pie does with most organizations. Click forward, please.
Sorry. Yeah.
And purpose isn't as quite as straightforward as we might think. There's all kinds of purpose. Many organizations may confuse it with just supporting a cause. That's completely valid. But purpose is much more than just adopting a social cause. Purpose often is most powerful inside an organization. So for many businesses, they'll focus on how they empower and motivate their staff. For other organizations, they might be looking at ESG and being a responsible corporate citizen, and others might embed that purpose through all their actions and to really drive long-term focus. For Brand Pie, our ethos is, working with organizations to define where on this spectrum of purpose they should sit. And the value of purpose to organizations, I think a lot of the, maybe 10 years ago, there may have been some cynicism and skepticism around it. That's largely disappeared. And perhaps the starting point of it disappearing was Larry Fink's letter to shareholders. He writes this letter each year. Here's a quote from the 2021 letter, where we're seeing that sustainability aligned with purpose is becoming increasingly important. In the UK this week, you may have seen the statement from the CBI around the cost benefit of purpose. According to the CBI chief, and a study they've done, is off the charts in terms of the benefit. And in the US, a similar organization, Business Roundtable, changed their raison d'etre from a focus on just returning shareholder value to a more purpose-driven agenda of delivering value to all stakeholders and all communities that businesses work with. So this is definitely a key thing for people to think about, and ensure that that story, how you position yourself around purpose, really comes through quickly and clearly. It will help you in all your networking. It'll help you form partners. It'll help you recruit talent, and so on and so forth. And then just a little bit from me on the approach that we take to help organizations do this. This is the model that we use, and this, I think, is a really simple way of explaining how you move from the more strategic thinking around your purpose. What's your North Star? Why do you exist? What are you going to achieve? What's your ambition? What does that purpose enable? And your strategy, how you deliver that purpose, through to how you activate. So the kind of context of purpose and your brand positioning, your campaigns, your messaging, those two things are really closely related. But the starting point is to define your purpose, and then make sure you embed that purpose in the way that you bring your story to life through creative activation. I thought I'd share one quick example of that with you, which is from a business called Creo. And Creo was actually, can we move forward one slide?
Yeah. Whoops. Whoa. Whoops.
We can let that play, Mary Lee.
I got ahead of myself. Okay.
Yeah, perhaps let that video play.
Okay. Yeah. Can everybody hear it?
Nature is the source of infinite creativity, and cannabinoids are one of its most amazing gifts. Today, thanks to one of nature's oldest processes, fermentation, Creo is unleashing the full potential of cannabinoids, transforming health, wellness, and nutrition, using technology that delivers innovation without doing undue harm to the planet. Join Creo in bringing cannabinoid-enabled products to every household. Nature loves our cannabinoids, and so will you.
So Creo is a business that was founded by two UK citizens now resident in the US, Cambridge graduates that met each other at university. Until a year ago, this business didn't have a name, didn't have any brand identity, had zero messaging. It was in stealth mode, had a bunch of patents on some biotechnologies. And basically, they found a way to use fermentation to create a range of cannabinoid ingredients. These are ingredients that are used commercially, things like anti-inflammatory drinks, anti-aging skin creams, that type of thing. So it's not cannabis that gets you high. The cannabinoids they create are scheduled drugs in the US, so anybody can use them free of any legal ramifications. And the start of their journey was to help the world understand the story they were telling and the purpose that they had. So if we move forward one slide more, this is kind of the meat of what we mean when we talk about defining your purpose and your story. You'll see here at the top, the purpose of Creo is to enable the creation of cannabinoid products that help people without doing harm to our planet. And in the video you just watched, you kind of saw that story come to life more creatively. The ambition that they have is to help deliver new cannabinoid products to every home. So this is a really mass market play. They're not the people that will make the products. The customers are the people that will make the products. They're the people who deliver the ingredients. So that's reflected in their positioning. We enable product developers to create innovative new consumer goods made with cannabinoids produced in a way that nature loves. And then their creative idea is nature loves our cannabinoids and so will you. And then they have a number of key messages, 3 key messages that the brand leans into around sustainability, around access to abundance. A lot of these cannabinoid ingredients in nature only appear in really trace amounts. They've been able to commercially scale these ingredients to really high volumes. We're talking tons of ingredients. And then there's a pillar around trust. They partnered and are financially supported in a joint venture by a really successful biotechnology company, Genomatica. And I think the interesting thing here is that they are very close now to IPO in the space of less than a year. So from having no story in the US market to going in strongly with a really purpose-driven positioning reflected in all their communications, they've been able to make a real impact at pace in this market. And then the next slide, I think, is just an example very quickly of the look and feel, the website, so some of the assets that they've made sure that they consistently bring their purpose to life through. And that's it.
I thought maybe I'd stop at, we put together a list of kind of 6 key marketing accelerator things that you might want to think about. We'll leave this up. It's really about, making sure that you've got your positioning and messaging in place, determining what's transferable, what will work and what won't work, prioritizing your targets in terms of customers, business goals, and being very focused around that, building your network amongst your peer set, your target customers, looking for audiences, cultivating influencers, both in the marketplace, but also the media space. And then obviously establishing your reach, looking at where the low-hanging fruit is and how you kind of prioritize how you come into the market. So I think we did that very quickly. I think we galloped through it, but we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions because I think you all will probably have very specific ideas or concerns or questions that you want to raise. So I'm going to just open the floor up. Maybe I'll just shut this down. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I can see we have we have a couple of questions already. One is around the video for Creo. It wasn't shown in paid media. It was mostly used at events. It was used as in business meetings as the opening slide. It's been used in across a lot of owned social properties. And the only paid activity has been some content partnerships with industry trade bodies as well, mostly organic use of that. And then there's also a question, not sure whether this can be shared, but it will be interesting what range a small mid-sized business should invest to build a brand. Really difficult question because there's a range of elements to that. There's how much do you invest in media, there's how much do you invest in production, building, creating videos, website, etc. And there's also how much should you invest in creating the core assets, your logo, your name, your positioning, your look and feel. So I'll perhaps take that last one. For a small to medium-sized business, getting the core elements of your brand defined, you should probably be looking at somewhere in the region of $150,000 to $250,000 is probably the that's for a very professional brand. For much smaller businesses, you may be looking at working with an individual freelancer to help you get the core assets together. The challenge with that, I would say, in the US market is there's a really high bar and expectation around the quality of how you present yourself. So we'd argue that the investment is most definitely worth it.
Yeah, I'll take the question about how important it is to stay consistent with your UK branding and imagery when growing into the US. It's really important, which is the point I was trying to make about making sure that you have your brand positioning right before you come here, because there's no boundaries these days. I mean, digital means that an American could look at your website in the UK and vice versa. There's just so much bleed in digital channels that you really need to be consistent. But then when you activate your brand in market, you need to be thinking about what's going to work well for that particular marketplace. But in terms of your brand and your positioning and your purpose and your overall going to market, you need to be very consistent. Prices vary significantly from state to state on cost for branding. That's true to a certain point. I don't know if you're talking about media. I don't know if you're talking about consulting firms. Maybe a little bit more specificity would be good on that question. Just looking, Angela.
Shirley, I think Angela from June Medical has a hand up.
Great. Hi, Angela.
Hi, thank you so much for that whirlwind. That was really interesting. It's funny because I'm just sitting here and my US team is actually pinging me from ongoing activities with customers. So I'm telling them that I'm being schooled in all things American. I just wanted to, we're toying around with the idea right now of moving production or setting up a separate production site in the US in addition to our UK manufacturing. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the importance of made in America for this. I appreciate I'm in the niche business and all of that in medical devices, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the general take on the made in America. More important, less important, increasing, decreasing, where are people these days?
I think it's probably, you're going to get a different answer from different people. My view is that it's increasingly important, but it is also to a certain extent driven by what's happening politically. But I would say it's definitely increasingly important. We're actually working with a firm right now in the biotech space who are building a plant in the US, and it's a huge plus. I mean, as they've been going to market, they've been talking to analysts and talking to the media about it. It's a huge plus for them.
Shirley, I wonder if you could talk a little bit maybe about sort of, time frames and time scales that companies should anticipate in terms of, rolling out, a brand that is, able to be consumed in the US and different assets. I mean, what does that look like for companies?
It really depends on what needs to be done. If it's everything, if it's from developing the positioning and the brand, it could take 6 months to a year. If it's more tactically led in terms of you've got everything in place, but you just want to have the assets, then maybe 6 months. But it really just depends on what needs to be done. Does that help? So another question, is it about getting the marketing right or just meeting the right people? I don't know that Rick or I can answer that question. I think it really depends on what it is you're trying to do and who your marketplace is. I can't stress enough that networking thing. I think it's super important here, much more so than in the UK, for all the reasons that we talked about earlier. And that will help speed everything along if you have the right kind of contacts and influencers on side.
I think it's the stage of your business as well. I think, if you're initially moving here, I think that, and you're very at the start of the journey, I think those early months, the first, 1 to 6 months, it's probably networking, meeting people, finding your hires, getting the business, just the core elements of your business. And then very quickly, I think it starts to change into how you present yourself. So I think you quickly have to mature. So I think maybe meetings initially and then marketing very quickly after that.
I love this question. What are the biggest mistakes companies make when launching a UK brand in the US? If you're quintessentially English, obviously that's great, go for it. If not, you really need to do your research and think about what's going to work here. I would say the biggest mistake is spreading yourself too thinly, because it's such a huge market on every single level. And so if you come in here thinking that you're going to take the world by storm, think again. Really be focused on who you're going to go after first. You know, prioritize where you want to spend your money. I think that's the biggest thing to do.
Yeah, and I think it's often a good idea to really do the research on a market. So maybe see the US a little, like Marilee was saying, like the EU. Are you going to launch in Chicago and focus on that local market to really test your proposition, your product? And then are you going to expand to the Southwest? Kind of almost a rolling program of city after city after city can be a really good idea.
Thanks, Mark. Just reading the chat. Yeah, I would advocate for definitely having people who know what they're doing here.
Mark, did you want to come in and comment, and for anyone who might not be able to see the chat?
Oh, so, okay, it's an observation. Key is working with people like Rick and Marilee to dig into your specific needs and next steps to take the right steps in right order. Companies should not try to enter the US market alone. Partnerships and experiences are key. And yes, it's 50 different economies with huge customer bases. Missouri, for example, is the same size as Scotland. So true. I mean, and you know, when I first moved back to the US from London after spending 17 years in London, I remember watching this program. It was a documentary, and it was filmed in the swamplands of around New Orleans and Louisiana. And I couldn't understand the language, and they were speaking English, but it was so accented. I did not know what they were saying. And in fact, I guess the producers realized that it was going to be difficult even for Americans to understand it. So they had subtitles. Or it was just unbelievable. So you really can't appreciate the differences until you get here and start living here and really start watching the news and seeing what's going on. And like I said, being in New York doesn't really cut it. You've got to get out into other places.
I'd say a watch out as well for on that kind of big mistakes that people make. British humor can be tricky to translate in the US, particularly if you're mass market. A lot of UK communications really leans into humor. It's a little less so in the US market.
Yeah, you can get something very wrong very easily. If you watch television commercials here, you'll notice a very big difference between how the sort of approach they take versus in the UK. Any other questions? I'm not sure if I missed any, kind of going through the list here. Please raise your hand if we haven't answered anything. Is here.
I mean, Mary, we covered a little bit about, what the investment looks like. We covered a little bit about, timeframes, I guess, more broadly speaking, in terms of who companies should go to, from a vendor perspective, is a agency like yours a one-stop shop? Are they going to have to expect to work with multiple different partners and vendors? What does that look like here?
I think to a certain extent, it kind of depends on where you are. Typically, if you're setting up in New York, you're probably going to be using New York business partners to kind of do things with you. Although COVID has taught us that we can get things from anywhere and we don't have to be in one place. It's been a very interesting year for us because we have new clients that we've signed on over the last 18 months that we've never met physically, which is just bizarre in our business, but it happens. So I think and that in itself, I would recommend once you start networking, asking for advice and recommendations, because again, there are so many people out there that you could work with. It's just helpful to have somebody give somebody a personal recommendation, because then you understand they're trusted and they're, reliable and etc.
I also said that in terms of the initial positioning and the initial kind of really high impact communications, I'd always recommend you try to find a one-stop shop for that, because I think the thinking stays pure. But then once you're in market, when you're getting into more kind of tactical ongoing campaigns, you probably want a mix of vendors, because the cost of using the people that do the high level strategy and hero assets will probably be too high, and you'll probably want a kind of lower cost vendor to do the tactics.
Mhm.
I love Angela's comment about humor. This is where it's good to be Swedish. I have terrible jokes in both countries. There's a question about what pre-work is required before engaging that helps give a business a jump start when working with you. I think, I'm sorry, did I miss something? I think that having a well thought out kind of objective or goal in the marketplace is always really helpful. So, you know, if you're coming into the market and you know that you want to focus on a particular set of states or a particular set of cities or a particular geography, and you know that you want to go after a certain type of buyer, having a little bit of background on that is always going to be very helpful. Typically, when we take on a new assignment with a client, we will do either a competitive audit or a peer audit, so that we're having a better understanding of how other organizations in your marketplace are going to market. Not so much about what they do and what they offer, but really how they show up and how they go to market. And that's always really helpful in terms of identifying gaps in the marketplace, or in terms of identifying where you could actually shine with a different type of strength. So that sort of research is really helpful.
I see a question about thoughts on bringing over the UK name or setting up a new brand in the US. I would say that the name of your business is one of the most powerful assets you have. And I would be very cautious about changing a name or having a different name in the US than the UK, unless there's a very strategic reason for doing that. You know, if you've got research that shows the name just doesn't resonate, or there's something weird about the name, then maybe. But in most instances, I would say stick with the name.
So we have another question from Angela, and then yeah, Angela, do you want to?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let this talent go untapped, so I'm going to take the opportunity. I just wondered if you have between the different countries, and I appreciate, again, this is going to be niche specific, but is there a way to calculate lifetime value of a customer and its acquisition in the US versus the UK? Is there a specific formula you use, or can that not be drawn? So for example, for us, it's very specific with regards to a customer lifetime for us here in the UK is worth X, but in the US it's worth Y. Therefore, I can spend more money there on getting that customer. Are there any rules with that, or is it so different from customer to customer?
I think it's probably different from customer to customer, but I don't know who your customers are, but I'm going to guess that in your business they must be the big healthcare providers. And is that correct? So I'm just going to extrapolate from that. Healthcare providers here are massive, and they differ from state to state. Again, there's a lot of consolidation going on in the healthcare providing business, and there's a lot of new entrants coming in as well, new ways of looking at healthcare. So tapping into that is probably important, but it's going to be really different. And I don't know that there's any one particular formula that's going to work.
Merrily, just a 5-minute warning here.
Okay.
5-minute mark.
So we have a question on language. If your website is written in UK English, Queen's English, thank you, but the content is globally relevant, would you recommend developing a US English version? I would recommend having one, and you got to choose one or the other. I will tell you that while we are larger in the UK than we are in the US, our website is in American English. We made that switch about 4 years ago because we felt it was important given the size of the market here. But it's really a personal choice from the company, but one or the other, and then just be consistent with it, I think is the recommendation. Is it worth checking the name to make sure it doesn't breach existing trademarks? Absolutely. Absolutely. How important is a marketing team based in the US as the HQ is in the UK? Is it not important because the brand identity should be the same? It's important from the point of view of understanding the nuances. You don't necessarily have to have a full team, but I would highly recommend that you actually have at least 1 or 2 people on the ground who really get it here, who really understand the US market and are not are outspoken enough to raise their hand and tell you when something isn't going to work when you're trying to make a dictate. I've seen this working on, I used to work for one of the big WPP companies, and I've seen it working on global businesses where you've got somebody from the center saying, no, this is going to work the same everywhere. And that's just not the case. So it's just helpful to have that person who understands it.
I think it's really important to separate identity from communications. Your identity should be absolutely ruthlessly consistent across all markets, but your tactical communications will feature different messages for different audiences in different places at different times. And that's where the value of local expertise becomes really important, understanding the messages that will resonate the most with a particular audience.
There's just one more question here. At what stage would it be useful to get assistance on the marketing side in terms of timing, but also in terms of balancing in-house resources versus support I can get externally? Again, I'm not sure that there is a one size fits all in that. And I would need to understand what you have in-house to understand how best to complement that from an external support perspective. But I think, again, I would say that it's really helpful to have at least, whether internal or external, somebody on the ground here who understands the marketplace and can advise on that. Have we captured everybody's questions? I think we have. Any last? Okay, any last ones? We got 2 minutes left. If not, I'll go have my cup of coffee.
Mary Lee.
I'll ask you a question with regards to press releases. Do you work with your normal agency through press releases, or do you work with a specialized press release agency for that, given the size of the country?
Do we work with, sorry, say that again?
Do you work with a regional press release agency, or do you work with a national one?
We work with a firm. We, Brand Pi, actually work with a firm that does both countries.
Okay, so that has both.
And they have a foot in both countries, so they understand the media nuances.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been fun.
We have, Mary Lee and Rick, we've put your contact information in the chat so that if people would like to follow up with you, separately on, more specific questions, they can do. And thank you both very much for taking us through. We covered a lot of ground, so I really appreciate it.
Well, I hope the rest of the workshop goes brilliantly. So thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to keep rolling. If I will talk slow, if you'd like to get yourself a coffee or take a small break. But we've equally have a lot of ground to cover in our next workshop, which is legal considerations for doing business in the US. An incredibly broad topic, and we have the right partners in place to do that. Really grateful to Roger Barton and his firm, Barton LLP, for joining us to take us through, all of the things that you all should be thinking about as you expand your business. And I can see that they're all together in person. And so we'll have one Zoom box, which is helpful. Roger and team, good to see you over there. I'm going to hand it over to you and Roger to introduce who you have with you.
Thank you, Tamara, and great program, Mary Lee and Rick. We're going to focus on the legal considerations for bringing your business to the U.S. Our law firm represents businesses across the world. We actually have 41 different countries from which we represent clients that come into the U.S., many of them from the U.K., obviously. Our thought here was to take you through a little bit of a cross-section of the different disciplines, the legal issues that you might face if you were to be bringing your business to the U.S. Once you're here and you want to grow it, dealing with employees, dealing with corporate issues, dealing with tax, and dealing with data protection, which of course is across the spectrum of all areas these days. Please, as you did in the last section, use the chat function. I'm going to monitor that as best I can. We'd like it to be interactive. We would hate to have 4 lawyers just boring you. So let's, ask your questions. We frequently, as I said, have clients come in and sit in this very room and ask us, what do I need to do first day to set up my business? What should I be thinking about in terms of structure? How should a U.S. business look? You just heard for branding purposes, but also now for legal purposes. And I should mention as well, and maybe we can put this in the chat or something, Tamara, but our firm produced a guide to expanding your business in the United States together with British American Business. And it covers many of the topics we'll have here, but even more. So I have with me Jonathan Kitchen, who's one of my corporate partners, who's going to talk about the sort of corporate structure of bringing your business to the U.S. Ian Shane, who has got an accent that many of you who are in the afternoon in London will recognize. He's dual qualified U.S. and U.K. tax lawyer. And Ken Rashbaum, who heads up our data and cybersecurity practice. And I will touch on some of the employment issues, which I think are relevant. It's a topic, I think, which is appropriate for the U.S. and the U.K. because I think, as everyone on this call probably knows, that the U.S. is the U.K.'s largest trading partner. Statistically, 25% of the U.K.'s outward foreign direct investment comes into the United States. Over 20% of the UK outbound services come into the United States. Over 15% of UK goods that are produced and are exported come into the US. And there's 1.25 million Americans that work for British companies in the US. And 1.5 million Britons are directly employed by US affiliates of UK companies. So there's no better trading partner to have, no better other country to focus on than the UK bringing their business to the US. So with that, I'm going to turn to John. And so much of this is combined with tax, but we'll try to handle this in a way that makes sense. But John, let's say a client comes into the office and says, I want to start my business in the US. What should they be thinking about in terms of a corporate structure, choice of entity, those things?
Certainly, Roger. And yeah, like you said, a lot of this is driven by tax. But there are some key foundational corporate elements that we'll need to bake into the advice we give a client who'd like to do that. I think first and foremost, it's to talk about what kind of entity you'd like to establish. In the US, there are pass-through limited liability companies, partnerships, as well as corporations, which you're all familiar with. Oftentimes for foreign businesses, it makes the most sense to form a corporation, especially given some of the tax considerations that Ian's going to go into a little bit later. So the first is to just determine the entity, determine where they're going to want to do business, where they're going to have a physical presence. Oftentimes, the jurisdiction for the entity formation is a jurisdiction like Delaware, California. We typically recommend Delaware, just given the fact that they have a very well-developed area of body of law for corporations, as well as very well-settled case law, very sophisticated judges. And it's also the most efficient in terms of cost and resource to establish a presence there. You don't need to have an actual physical location in Delaware. There are third-party agents who will do that for you, and we often use them and work together with them. And then to determine where you're going to actually operate, you'll need to qualify to do business in those jurisdictions. So those are kind of the initial elements. And then as you're thinking about further structure, the board, the officers, you're going to have to look at your own ownership for your foreign company, whether it's institutional, foreign persons, where they're located, and think through how you're going to work governance, economics, and frankly, the day-to-day operations of the business into the equation.
So John, some of the questions I get are, okay, I'm in the UK. We have 5 owners in the UK, 5 individuals. We want to come to the US. Should those same individuals own the company in the US? Should the company in the UK own the company in the US? Can foreign individuals own US companies, or how do you handle that?
Yes, so foreign nationals can certainly own an interest, especially if we're going the preferred route of Delaware Corp. Oftentimes, foreign corporations can also own an interest. The U.S. is, as you'll find, a very business-friendly country overall. What's also important to keep in mind is that the U.S. is comprised of 2 different states that all have their own set of laws and considerations when you're operating here. Again, we're sort of presuming Delaware's because it's the most straightforward. So yes, foreign nationals can certainly own an interest in a Delaware corporation. There are some wrinkles to that when you start opening bank accounts, because any bank will require a tax ID number, which oftentimes it's much easier to have a US national involved, but it's still possible, certainly, to obtain an EIN or a tax ID number with a foreign national as owner.
And Ian, tax is everything, right?
It is everything.
So
It always comes down to tax.
It does. So in terms of the tax considerations, there's different types of legal entities, different tax treatments for those entities. Can you share a little bit what someone should think about when they come into the US?
So as John has mentioned, really the two most common entities used to operate a business in the US is the limited liability company, the LLC, and what is often called a C Corp here, which is the equivalent of a UK limited liability company. The LLC has problems if the owner of the LLC directly is a foreign entity. And these problems come along because the LLC is a flow through. It's a partnership. It's taxed as a partnership in the US if there's more than one member, members being the equity holders, and it's a disregarded entity if there is only one member, meaning for tax purposes, and we are now talking just tax, the entity would be completely disregarded. And it's as if the UK parent or UK individuals were doing business directly in the US. So the LLC, like a partnership, although it has to file a return, it isn't a taxpayer. It is the members, the equity holders, who pay tax. So that means that if the equity holder is, for example, for a UK limited, that UK limited has got to get a tax ID number in the US, which can be a hassle for foreign entities. On top of that, the members have to file a tax return, and they also are subject to opening their books to audit from the IRS. So the IRS comes along and audits the LLC. It's also going to audit the actual parties that pay the tax, which are the members of the LLC. And most foreigners do not want to get a tax ID, find themselves filing tax returns in the US, and they certainly don't want to open their, well, possibly worldwide books to the IRS. So the standard practice for companies coming in, say, from the UK to operate in the US is to form a corporation, a C corporation. And this is what we call a blocker. And it blocks the shareholders from being in business in the US. So the C Corp will pay tax. It can be audited. It needs a tax ID number, which because it's US is fairly easy to get hold of. But the owners in the UK or wherever do not have to bother about filing returns or dealing directly with the IRS.
Okay. And there's a question. Emmanuel, did you want to ask your question live?
One moment, I just, because I've taken a few questions that people sent to me directly. You may cover this in a moment already, but a question that we just received from one of our colleagues on the call and that regularly pops up in advice sessions that BAB convenes with smaller mid-sized companies is, what about liability exposure when expanding to the US? So some companies think about, would it reduce our liability if we had a representation there? And then linked to that, a case that we recently had was where a company thought about, would it be useful to have a representation in the US, meaning a legal entity, and then also create a second legal entity in the UK to which that entity is linked to reduce liability risk even further? I hope that makes sense and reflects the question that I just received. If not, Philip, feel free to jump in. Thank you very much.
Sure. So yes, I think in answer to your question, in one of the questions, a corporation will help block liability in terms of the individual underlying shareholders with a US representation, right? If that representation is evidenced or manifested through a US corporation, the liability can stop there. As Ian mentioned, an LLC also helps block liability. Purposes of liability shield is in effect a corporation, although it is taxed as a partnership, which again can cause some issues for foreign owners and foreign shareholders. So The answer is yes. As to whether there will need to be a local or UK or foreign jurisdiction to the US entity that then steps between the US business representation and the shareholders, that's more of a facts and circumstances type analysis, depending on what the business is undertaking, the nature of the underlying shareholders, and whether you may want to have that. And we put that in place. For example, if the US business requires an LLC, you may want to have that foreign corporation sit between in order to make sure governance, like you said, in order to make sure that the foreign entities' books aren't opened up to the US, but also, frankly, from a liability standpoint to help shield.
There's also frequently a question about intellectual property rights and whether those should be housed in a separate corporation as well for liability purposes. So sometimes we'll set up multiple corporations that will hold different assets and operate as a combined whole, which can be done as well.
Thank you very much. I just see a second question, and that may also link up to Angela Spang and her company, June Medical. Question is, when does a company have to think about setting up a legal entity, especially if you are a UK company that produces in the UK and has started exporting to the US and now looks into establishing a sales network? When would it be useful to then think about establishing a legal entity in the US?
I'll take the first part of that, and then I'm going to kick it over to Ian because again, unfortunately and fortunately, because we have folks like Ian here on the team who practice both UK and US tax law, which is tremendously helpful for our clients. It's largely driven by tax. However, I think it depends on what that physical US presence is going to look like, right? If there are simply distribution agreements in place on the ground in the US with the parent abroad, I think that's one issue. And I think the question really gets to timing. And I think it's when you want to establish a physical presence here in the US, whether that means manufacturing, having distribution hubs, having employees who will be situated here in the United States. I think those are the times we've seen clients start to think about, establishing a US business. Ian touched on it earlier, but with a corporation and being a US taxpayer, having the subsidiary be a US taxpayer, you also get to allocate expenses and costs to that entity to help reduce otherwise income that would flow through to the home country. So you're able to take advantage of sort of tax arbitrage and make sure you're paying the lowest corporate tax rate. And there are also those sort of considerations. So I think, Ian.
Well, like any taxing jurisdiction in the world, they want to try and get money from you for tax. So the question then becomes, when are you doing enough in the US to be taxable? Luckily here, we have the UK-US double tax treaty that sets out general rules. And those general rules say if what you're doing in the US is merely preparatory, so you're doing market research, you're looking at whether your product will sell, who your customers might be, that is not enough under the treaty to be taxable in the US. But if you start signing contracts in the US, then you're going to be taxable. And if you haven't set up a US entity, then it is going to be the UK company or the UK individual that's doing business in the US. And as I talked about with LLCs, they're going to be filing tax returns. There's also, the US has a branch profits tax, which is a nasty little tax. And I always advise clients to structure in such a way that you're not a branch and that just keeps you out of the branch profits tax. But you really do not want to open up an inquiry from the IRS or from a particular state as to whether you are doing business or not. So my advice is always at the earliest possible opportunity, you want to form a US entity.
Yeah, and just to expand on one thing Ian touched on, which I think is very critical, that there are oftentimes industry-specific considerations, right? I understood this question came from Geomedica, pardon. So there may be regulatory components to the analysis as well. What industry are you operating in? Is the activity regulated in the US? And we can help certainly think through any of those issues, or local counsel should help think through any of those issues.
Thank you very much. We have a few more questions actually coming in, but maybe you continue with the presentation. Otherwise, let me know and I can pose those questions on behalf of colleagues who have sent them in.
Sure, and we're happy to jump around. So I'll touch on employment for a moment, because I think we're taking it sort of in the logical sequence of setting up the company and assessing the tax ramifications. One of the first questions we typically get is, we want to bring some people over, or we want to hire some people, and what are the U.S. employment laws like, and what do we have to be concerned about? And it's always interesting for me because in not just the UK, but many jurisdictions, the employment laws are so favorable towards employees that the benefits that are given, in terms of insurance, in terms of vacation pay, in terms of a number of different considerations are so generous, the ability to hire and fire and so forth. Whereas it's not as litigious as it is in the United States. And so I have a lot of clients who come in and they're concerned. We have to give all these benefits. It's a very employee-friendly environment because that's what we're used to. In the home country and the United States, everybody sues each other, so I'm going to get sued. So it's the worst of both worlds. It's not the worst of both worlds. The US is somewhat independent, and this depends state by state and even within local jurisdictions, employee-friendly, but not as much still as much of Europe is, but we are litigious. The concept in the United States is a few things to focus on. There's the federal laws, there's the state laws, and there's the local laws. And as John said earlier, when you're thinking of forming a company, you have 50 different states. The same thing when you employ people, you're gonna have 50 different states in which they're employed. And then even here sitting in New York City, we have a number of New York City laws that govern how we have to deal with our employees. So just be aware that you're in different jurisdictions. I won't go into what's required in each one. I will just say generally California is very employee friendly. New York is somewhat in the middle. New York City is very employee friendly. So you have to kind of see where you stand on those things. The overriding concept, however, is employment at will. I can hire you for any reason as long as I'm not discriminating. I cannot discriminate on, there's 7 factors of discrimination that you cannot take into account when you hire, nor can you take that into account when you fire. But I can certainly, if I'm not discriminating, I can fire you because today's Wednesday and I'm in a grumpy mood and I just want to fire you. That's okay. So as long as it's not for discriminatory purposes. The New York has some weird things about when you're interviewing people, can you ask them how much money they're currently making? No. You need to have anti-harassment training. That's not weird, but that's a New York City requirement. We're even moving potentially against the employment at will concept with fast food workers. There's a move to require a reason to fire folks like that. So again, be aware that there's different laws in different areas. One of the focuses that we handle for clients, particularly the businesses that are coming in and are hiring more senior people, their concern relates to what we call restrictive covenants. What can I do to prevent these people, should they leave my company, from hurting us? Can we prevent them from competing with us, a non-compete provision? Can we prevent them from once they leave from soliciting our customers and our employees? Can we require them to keep information confidential? Those are the 3 main things that clients are concerned about. And the answer is, like every lawyer is going to tell you, it depends. The toughest one to enforce is the non-compete provision. Many people are familiar with contracts where the employee for 6 months or 12 months or whatever it is after the date the employment ends is not allowed to go work for a competitor. And that is it's defined within the agreement. Courts in New York and elsewhere are hesitant to enforce those provisions. New York's what they call a blue pencil state, so it will rewrite the provision if it thinks it's too broad, either in terms of geography, time, or scope. Other states will just nullify it completely. So you need to be aware of, can you enforce a non-compete, and that there is a bias, if you will, or a preference among the judges to allow people to work. So as an employer trying to keep somebody on the sidelines, garden leave is, in the UK is referred to, very difficult in the United States, particularly if you're not paying them. So if they leave you voluntarily, they go across the street to a competitor, you want to stop them from working there, it's going to be hard. It can be done, but it's going to be hard. Confidentiality agreements, however, are much more enforceable. They cannot take confidential information, and that's considered things like customer list, pricing, how you make the secret sauce, the formula for Coca-Cola, those types of proprietary things. If a company guards that information, generally it's going to be protected. Non-solicit is a little bit more difficult. Can you solicit customers away from your former employer? Those are sometimes enforced. More often than not, I think you do get those enforced. Can you solicit away employees? The practical rubber meeting the road aspect of that thing is the former employee is not soliciting directly, but everyone in the company is aware of where that person works. They're on LinkedIn. The employee contacts the former employee and says, I'd love to come work with you. That's not considered a solicitation. So you're allowed to accept an inbound unsolicited inquiry from someone who may want to work at your company. So when we draft employment agreements, we build in all those protections, but you need to be aware, as I said earlier, that it's state by state, and not always, even if it's in your agreement, and we recommend many times you put it in the agreement because it does have a deterrent effect. It may not always be as enforceable as you might like. I think we should turn, if there's no questions on specifically employment issues, and we can come back if there's time later, Ian, to talk about foreign employees and how they may be taxed while they're here as residents. But I'd like to turn to the moment to Ken on data privacy. There used to be more of a disconnect between the US and I think the UK. GDPR and UK Data Protection Act are the gold standard, if you will. If a company is adhering to those standards, are they okay in the US? They're not okay in the US? What are the considerations that really need to be taken into effect?
Well, thanks, Roger. And for years, the GDPR and the UK Data Protection Act were and certainly are still the gold standards, but America has discovered data privacy, data protection generally in a big way in the last couple of years. I think Winston Churchill said it best when he said, Americans generally get it right, but only after they've exhausted all other alternatives. And we had those alternatives for many years by ignoring privacy, but things have changed in a big way. The $5 billion penalty to Facebook, for example, is a good way to look at how things have changed here. Apple has changed its privacy settings so that now it will notify the user and ask for consent to track. This comes straight from the GDPR and to an extent from the UK Data Protection Act. Google has now announced it will no longer track people across the internet. So you have now a sea change in the United States where privacy is viewed as a business imperative, more so than it was, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago. What makes it different here, though, is the lack of a national data protection law. We don't have one except in 3 segments, which are healthcare, education, and for public companies under Regulation SP of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So we have 6 states that have their own explicit data protection laws, but many more that have consumer fraud laws, which will come into play if you are not transparent with why you're collecting information, how you're collecting it, with whom you're sharing it, what the data subject's rights are, and how you're keeping the information secured. Plus, layered on top of that, you have regulatory agencies at the federal level, like the Federal Trade Commission, which I mentioned earlier, or the Office for Civil Rights of Health and Human Services, which are becoming much more aggressive in enforcement of data protection. And finally, every one of the 50 states, everyone, has a data breach notification law. So if we get a call, for example, from a client who said they've had a data breach, our first question is, from what states and countries do the data subjects derive? Because the laws are different in terms of the timing of the notice, the content of the notice, who must be notified, and whether credit monitoring must be offered. So we have a multi-fragmented state of play in data protection in the United States.
And Ken, it's daunting for a startup business in the US. How do you, for budget purposes, how do you handle compliance in a way that, you know, is economically efficient, if you will?
And that's a question I get asked all the time. I have clients who have to answer it in multiple states and multiple different regulatory schemes. So what we do is we tell them there are common principles among the different states. There is a baseline, if you will, that will apply to most states and regulatory agencies. If you put those in your policies and procedures, if you train your workforce on them, then creating the outliers, the appendices, if you will, for the states and regulations that are different is not that difficult. It's not that difficult. Once the general concepts have been taught through workforce training. And the business impacts are very clear. I don't know if you want me to get to that at this point.
Sure. Pardon the fire drill that's going on outside the conference room here, but go ahead.
There are two real key areas for business impact. One is revenue, and the other is investment. And both of them come right back to data protection. After Target had, which is a department store chain in the United States, had its major breach in 2013, its revenue declined by 36%. The following year. Home Depot, another chain, had a similar decline. But the opposite is also true, and Apple is a great example of that. One of the reasons why people in the United States purchase Apple products, although they're more expensive, is, of course, better design and user friendliness, but also Apple has marketed privacy. It has marketed the fact that it will safeguard privacy better than their competitors do. And surveys and polls generally confirm this. There is a competitive advantage to privacy. Most of the clients that come to work with us here don't come to us because they're worried about being sued, although, of course, that's an issue in the United States. They come to us because they have a business partner that wants to give them a very lucrative contract if they meet the requirements of certain state, federal laws and regulations. So they will ask us to facilitate that compliance aspect. For investment purposes, we work with private equity funds and venture capital organizations who will specifically ask, what is the regulatory scheme and compliance for data protection of the company in which we want to invest or the company in which we want to acquire? This is clearly money coming in the door. And not 2 weeks ago, Moody's, one of the largest credit rating agencies in the world, recently acquired a major stake in a security risk assessment organization called BitSight. Why? So that Moody's can now have cybersecurity as part of its credit rating. There is a straight line to be drawn in these aspects from data protection to revenue, to money coming in the door. The time is past when data protection officers would have trouble getting budget for their plans. Now they can show a clear return on investment, and that's one of the reasons why data protection awareness has grown to such an extent in the United States.
Thank you. I'm going to the chat. Couple of sort of employment / tax issues. Can it says, question, I guess, coming from the UK. Can I pay a US-based sales rep out of the UK? Answer is yes, but there's tax implications.
Yes, you're still going to have to operate the withholding rules. So you have to operate the US's equivalent of PAYE. So you've got to withhold tax both at the federal, state, local level, and Social Security. Even if it's just one employee, there's no de minimis exception.
And I guess a related question is, what is the withholding tax that a company, and is there a payroll tax as well that's associated?
Yes, I mean, there will be, as I said, it's the equivalent of PAYE. We just call it withholding over here, but it's all necessary taxes that an employee has to pay will be withheld from their salary.
And then in terms of, and this is a big tax issue these days, trading digitally with companies in the United States or across the United States, what are the tax implications there?
Wow. How many hours do you have? And how bored do you want to get? Basically, trading digitally, just say two things. So if you're talking about cryptocurrencies, from a US perspective, the simplest way of putting it is if you make a profit, you're going to be paying tax on it. That's all there is to it. And you have to declare an interest in cryptocurrencies. That's the area coming. If you're talking about selling online, I'm going to come to that in a little bit with regards to sales tax. Even the laws probably the easiest thing to say is the laws in the US have not caught up with technology. So that if you're in the UK and you're selling into the US, but you do not have a fixed place of business and physical employees in the state, which is what the treaty talks about, you having to have, then you're not doing business in the US for income tax purposes. For sales tax purposes, you might be. And I'm just going to leave it there.
I'm going to come back to you on that, though. So in terms of corporate income tax, is it the same on both sides of the Atlantic, or is there a difference?
Well, the major difference, it is a difference, and the major difference is that in the UK, there's really just one flavor of corporate income tax, whereas in the US, we have three different flavors. You have federal, you have state, and you have local. And when it comes to federal, it really doesn't matter what state you operate in. You've got to pay your federal taxes, federal corporate income tax. You've got to file your returns. When it comes to a state, the issue is, are you doing business in that state? So a state will want to know if you're doing business, and as John mentioned earlier, if you're doing business in the state, you've got to register, and registration is really no more than to say to the state, "Hi, I'm here, come tax me." But for states, and you'll see this theme going through everything that we're saying, there's 50 different states, and there's 50 different sets of rules as to when you're doing business in that state. But the overriding principle is you don't have to be doing very much to be doing business in a state. And the example I always give is you may be bringing goods into the United States and you may put them in a warehouse. And that warehouse is a third-party warehouse. So you just pay rent to that warehouse in order to get your goods stored for a period of time. But you have no fixed place of business. You're not doing any sales in that state. You're not, you've got nothing. But the fact that you have goods in a warehouse in many states is good enough to mean that you're doing business in the state. And if you're doing business in the state, you've got to file a tax return. You've got to pay tax in the state. So you could find yourself paying corporate income tax in many different states. You shouldn't be double taxed. There are rules between the states that mean that you shouldn't be double taxed, but it's not like international. There's no treaty between the states. And in some areas, you can find yourself double taxed. Lastly, the third flavor of corporate income tax in the US is what you call local. Could be a municipality, more often than not, it's cities. Some cities charge tax, some cities don't. A perfect example of that is that New York and San Francisco charge a corporate income tax. San Francisco and Boston do not. It just depends. And there are smaller places that you've probably never heard of. New York has the city of Yonkers. They charge a form of tax. So tax comes in 3 layers. That's the main difference.
Lovely, right? There's a question here about carrying losses forward and so forth, but in my experience, there's generally broader questions about when you form a company, it's obviously needs to be funded, and it's typically funded from the UK entity or the principals themselves. So you've got to capitalize it. We can talk about, there's no per se capital requirements in the US. But generally speaking, the US business is going to be a loss-making enterprise in the beginning year or so,
Yeah.
right? From a corporate perspective and a tax perspective, what's the best way to structure capitalizing the company and then being able to take advantage of, if there are losses, are those losses taken here? Are they taken in the UK? How does that work?
Sure. Go ahead.
Well, from a tax perspective, as you have said, Roger, there's not really a debt to equity ratio rules that are used in many other countries, but there are earnings stripping rules. So if you have too much debt, according to these earnings stripping rules, this is intercompany debt, or the rates are too high, you will not get a deduction for that debt, which will affect the amount of loss that you make. The earnings stripping rules are complex. I don't want to go into detail here. I'm only going to put you to sleep. I know it's probably after lunch in the UK, but just to say, you've got to be aware of these rules for intercompany debt. When it comes to losses, things basically, before COVID, the rules were that you couldn't carry loss back to earlier years, but you could carry losses forward indefinitely. It's worth saying that if there is a change of control of the company, then losses cannot be used after the change of control. COVID came in, and temporarily you can now carry losses back. And I believe that you can go back as far as 5 years, but this is very temporary. So you should really think about, as far as losses go, going forward.
What about deductions on third-party debt?
Yes, you get deductions on third-party debt. And the third-party debt, the earnings stripping rules do not apply. They only apply to intercompany debt.
Yes, so oftentimes what you'll see is foreign companies, or rather US companies owned by foreign companies. And again, the Delaware C Corp is sort of the gold standard. It's what investors like to see. It's what buyers like to see. So oftentimes you will see third-party debt as one of the favored financing tools that folks use. Also equity, especially again for the Delaware C Corp, that's kind of, you'll see typically a mix of debt and equity. If it's externally funded, internally funded, usually mostly equity.
There's a question earlier. Can I avoid paying US tax and tariffs when I send a small quantities of a product from the UK to the US? Where would I have to pay tax on those products?
Tariffs, I can't talk about. That is a completely different world. I wouldn't have a clue. As far as tax is concerned, it's really, as I've said already, if you have an office or fixed place of business in the US and you sell in the US, you're going to be paying tax in the US. As a general rule, it sounds from the question, because it's just small amounts, as if that's not going to be the case, in which case you'll be paying tax in the UK and not the US. I mean, I would just actually add one other thing. We can dig into it more complicatedly, which I don't want to do, but just to say, there are also rules, and this is more for bigger shipments, of where does the risk pass? Where does the interest in the property passes? If it passes outside of the US, then tax is outside of the US. If it passes in the US, then it's taxes in the US. But these are general rules.
Question about a director's loan. So the director, I assume, of the company makes a loan to the company. Is that third-party debt?
That's, I would say that's not third-party debt, that's affiliated debt.
Yeah. Just clarified, owner. So if an owner makes the loan, that's affiliated.
That's affiliated debt.
And what's the treatment of that for tax purposes?
But it's debt, but the rates must be market rates. And the company, if you're talking about a foreign owner, then these earnings stripping rules, you mustn't have too much debt according to those rules. If a person is within the US, then the IRS don't care.
Okay. I guess related to this, we should probably talk about transfer pricing, because companies try to allocate their profits either to the U.S. entity or to the foreign entity, and they're selling each other goods and services and so forth. Just broadly speaking, what are the considerations to watch out on in terms of transfer pricing?
So if on the assumption that the rates in the UK, the corporate tax rate is lower than in the US, part of the tax planning is going to be to try and get money out back to the UK pre-tax, which you can do generally by intercompany debt, but subject to the earnings stripping rules, royalties if you have intellectual property, and just management charges or intercompany services. We've talked about the debt side. So really when it comes to royalties and management services, that's transfer pricing. The royalty must be market. The fees being paid by the US entity for services provided by its UK affiliate must be market. Now in the UK, a company has to be a certain size before HMRC takes a great deal of interest in transfer pricing. That is not the case in the US. The IRS are very hot on transfer pricing for big companies and for small companies. And the one thing that you do not want to do is simply say, well, let's just come up with a number for transfer pricing. Let's do it on a cost plus basis, and let's just come up with, let's say 10%. Because the first thing the IRS will ask if they audit is going to be, how did you come up with that number? And if it was just something, well, it seemed reasonable at the time, that won't fly. The important thing in the US, if you're audited, is documentation. If you're going to have royalties, you're going to need a license, something the IRS can look at. If you're going to have intercompany company services, you need an intercompany services agreement that sets out what each party will do and what will be paid. Because if you don't have that, then the IRS is going to come along and they're going to say, this is what we think is happening here. This is what we think is the right fee. And you are going to have the job of proving that what the IRS say is wrong. If you have the documentation in place, then the IRS have got the job of proving that the document, what's actually happening and what is set out in the documentation are not the same thing. And in my experience, unless there's something really bad going on, they'll look at the documentation, but they'll go away again.
Quick question, I think you touched on earlier, but that has come in. Why not use an LLC instead of a C corporation?
Yes, so an LLC, I think for a completely US-based business and ownership, the LLC is certainly the preferred way to go. It affords the most flexibility. It's taxed as a partnership. It can be a flow through. It blocks liability. The interests are freely transferable. Although, and this is part of the reason why you'd want to tend towards a corporation for foreign ownership, in the US, it's much easier to issue shares, dispose of shares, take in investors with a corporation. And that's why you'll see in the VC world, in the venture capital or private equity world, they'll prefer to buy into or invest into a corporation unless it's a particular type of corporation within a certain state. But generally speaking, a Delaware C Corp is the gold standard again. So you've got, number one, it's preferred by investors or future funders of your business. I think it also blocks liability, and there could be a potential tax and cost allocation benefit, which I think Ian will touch on again. And then you've got, as Ian mentioned as well, which is a very real consideration. You've got the branch office issue where you open yourself up to inspection, oversight, and frankly, just general probing and communications you don't want to be having with the US tax service.
Yeah. So also, I'm going to tell you one very good reason why you don't want to own a US business from a foreign country, and it's particularly true of the UK, through an LLC. And that is, you will be double taxed. The US treats an LLC as a partnership or as a flow through. As I've already said, the members pay the tax, not the entity. The US treats the LLC like a limited liability company. it treats the LLC as the taxpayer. So there are cases in the US, they're fairly consistent, which is if the individual pays tax on behalf of the LLC, the UK will not give a credit for US taxes paid by a UK individual. So that is one very good reason. John's mentioned lots of others, but if you don't want to be double taxed, you don't want an LLC.
Let's turn, because we're coming short on time. I want to turn to a category of the phase of life of business, which everyone hopes who brings their business over here. It's grown, it's huge, it's making lots of profit, it's doing wonderfully. You know, what are ways in which that company can then go from strength to strength in terms of, are there M&A transactions, finance transactions, making use of private equity? What are the tools in the market that the US has where I think we can help companies to grow even more?
It's a great question, and hopefully something we're all going to deal with. I think to the extent that the investments in the US, the company, the subsidiary, the operating business is structured in a way, as we've described, it's tax efficient, it works for you. I think the capital markets, institutional investors, the private equity venture investors are certainly willing and have been to a very large extent funding foreign-owned US businesses, whether they're subsidiaries or completely just operating entities that are owned by foreign investors, that they're completely open to financing those businesses and to making significant investments. And you've seen, you know, on a year-over-year basis, I don't know the exact dollar amount, but certainly M&A activity, private equity, venture capital investments are certainly up year over year. And, you know, before COVID, we were also in a very strong investing environment, and you're seeing large funds being raised across industries in the private equity and venture world right now. I think one trend that's definitely sort of front of page for us in the US is that the amount of commercial financing available through the traditional banks has also been increasing. And, you know, in the US, there were several, as there were elsewhere in the world through the COVID pandemic. You know, there were certain stimulus measures that were passed. In the US, it was the, you know, Paycheck Protection Program through the Small Business Administration, where lenders were slammed, and they're finally starting to have some extra capacity to look elsewhere, look at opportunity. Like most sophisticated investors, you know, these institutions are looking to invest through the downturn to help their clients do so, and frankly position everyone for success as we rebound through this. So I think the punchline is that for foreign-owned businesses that, you know, operate in the US, there is effectively no difference, provided it's all structured in the right way and in a way that works.
And if you're a foreign-owned business and you're doing well and you want to access the capital markets or potentially engage in an M&A transaction, do you use, not lawyers, because you should always use lawyers, no question about that, other investment advisors that are out there, investment bankers and so on? How do you navigate those waters?
Yeah, I think it depends, Roger. I mean, you know, we have clients come to us with all sorts of different things in mind. If you're a foreign business and you're saying, hey, how can I get involved in the US market? You know, we may sell some product there. We don't have any distributors, you know, and you may want to participate in an auction. You know, I think that's one of the opportunities where on the buy side, the investing side, you'll likely want to work with a professional, whether it's a banker or a business broker, depending on the size of the transaction. I think a lot of clients come to us with discrete targets already in mind. In that instance, it's not always necessary to work with a banker. I think you'll see folks, you know, more engage a tax advisor to make sure that the structuring works both on the US and the UK or foreign side. And it also, frankly, depends on your internal resources. If you've got a very robust corporate development strategy organization within your business, they can be a huge resource. They're often, you know, former bankers, former lawyers, and they understand how deals work, how to structure them, and how to make them successful.
Just got a question. I think, Angela, can we bring you in to ask your question? Because I think it's got a lot of parts to it.
Thank you for letting me try to explain that. I'm sorry, Swedish. So when the sentences get long, I get confused. So my question was, first, thank you. This has been very helpful and such good information across the board. My question is specifically around, as a UK company manufacturing in the UK, having a US entity, now just having been approved as a supplier to the military VA hospitals, which we're obviously very proud of, but we have another large buyer in the US who is querying our UK-based global insurance cover. And I brought this up in a couple of different ways, and I just wanted to see this expertise in the room around the table with your thoughts around that, because clearly if the US government is happy with our insurance being covered, I'm struggling to understand. I just wanted to get a sense for what your thoughts are from a legal perspective with regards to insurance cover. Does it have to be a US company providing that insurance, or should a UK-based insurance company give us the same global coverage no matter what country they're based in?
Great question. Thank you for that. Sometimes the global coverage will be sufficient if, and this is a big if, it doesn't exclude certain types of claims in the United States. I review these policies for many of our non-US clients, and I see these exclusions all the time. So that's where the problem would come in. And to your point of if it's good enough for the federal government, the Department of Defense, shouldn't it be good enough for the buyer? The criteria will be different. The buyer may have higher standards for coverage. They may want, for example, an additional insured provision so that in effect the buyer is another beneficiary and can make a direct claim to the carrier. The US government would probably be less concerned about that. But the bottom line is someone has to look at the global policy and see what the coverage is, and then discuss with the buyer what the buyer's requirements are in that coverage, because you may be able to go out and get an endorsement that closes the gap if there is one.
Yeah, and Ken, just to build off that, I think that's a key element, which is that, oftentimes it's somewhat counterintuitive, but the private business who's a buyer may have a lower risk tolerance, right? And so they're going to push a lot of that risk onto you and your insurance policy. I think, a lot of insurance brokers, insurance underwriters are happy to sort of do one-off endorsements, or think about other risks that your potential buyers' clients may find.
Thank you. This is specifically in healthcare, and of course there is a high level of risk management going on in any of these providers, which is absolutely fair. I was unaware that of course they might have certainly a different insurance level themselves than the US government. I was struggling with marrying the two together. How can we get a yes in one place and a no in another? But that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Sure. Ken, maybe take a minute or two. You want to touch on what's the market like these days for cyber risk insurance?
The market has tightened dramatically globally, but in the US in particular, because of the amount of claims that were paid, especially for ransomware. During COVID. The premiums are going up between 25 and 50%. Underwriting has gotten much tighter. So some of our clients now, instead of receiving one or two-page applications, will have 8 to 10 supplemental applications. Some of the carriers will be insisting on doing their own assessments of the company for cybersecurity controls in particular. It's much harder to get this cover now. Many companies are moving out of the market entirely. Even to renew your policy is not necessarily a given anymore. So the advice that we've been giving is get your controls for data protection in place well before your renewal date, or if you can, before your application date, because these things take time to implement.
Any closing points that anybody wants to make?
Just on top of what Ken said, and I think it gets to Angela's question, but that's why it's really important to choose your advisor as well. And in the instance of insurance, your broker can make a really big difference in ensuring that you've got sort of market clearing coverage, because your clients, your suppliers sometimes are going to require certain standards. And so I think it's important, whether it's legal, insurance, to choose those advisors carefully.
And remember too, insurance is a contract. You will only get the coverage that's stated in the policy. The courts in the US will not impute coverage where it doesn't exist. If a provision is phrased in a vague way, the presumption will be in favor of coverage, but you need to read the policy very closely and not just with the broker. Yes, definitely talk to the broker, but have your insurance expert, either in-house or external, review it as well. Remember, the broker wants to sell insurance, okay, which is not to disparage the broker, but it also is helpful to have counsel look at it because counsel's up to date on what the courts are doing. Business interruption based on COVID is a great example of that. Courts are split across the United States on this, and whether you're going to have cover or not is going to largely be dependent on where you are located. Also, if you're putting in those data protection controls that I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Make sure you're transparent with your data subjects about why you're collecting their information, what you're collecting, with whom you're sharing it with, and what their rights are. That varies according to state law. Make sure you have access controls in place, so not everybody has access to everything, and certainly not to administrators' rights. And make sure you have workforce training in effect. All the applications I've looked at in the last 2 months ask that very question. Not just do you have controls, have you told the company about them, have you implemented them, and are you monitoring to make sure that the company is complying with them?
Right, thank you. Ian, any closing words? Pay your taxes.
Pay your taxes. The closing words are simply, we've discussed mostly corporate income tax. Just want to throw out that the US does not have a VAT or a goods and services tax. The federal government has no tax at the sales services level. The states do, not all of them, but there's sales taxes. And just as I said that it's very easy to be doing business in a state without really knowing it, you could also be liable for sales tax if you're selling goods, mostly tangible personal property, into a state where you have no other presence.
Oh, thank you. And from my side, on the employment side, one thing I didn't mention, but often comes up with companies who come in, they like to hire independent contractors. They don't want to have employees. And there are instances where it's appropriate to have an independent contractor, but our government, particularly the Department of Labor, is very, very strict and scrutinizes very carefully whether that person should be classified as an independent contractor, because they lose tax on that. So if it looks like an employee, they're under your control, they don't have other outside work, they're working out of your facility, there's a number of different factors to consider. They may well be an employee, and you should take guidance on whether or not you should characterize them as such and pay them as such, because that's a big challenge for startup foreign businesses. Kate, thank you for putting our contact information in the chat. We're happy to follow up with anybody who's interested. And thank you everyone for participating. Thank you to my colleagues here. And Emmanuel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Walter. And what a substance and great coverage of issues that you just offered to all of us. Let me say a big thanks to you, Jonathan, Ian, and Kenneth for your session. Kate just sent the guide that you produced for the US in the chat. So please, everyone, feel free to have a look at that. Otherwise, we will also send it as a follow-up. It's worth having a look into it. We have come to the end of the program, of our Accelerate Workshop program. This program was really designed, as Tamara said in the beginning, to respond to an increasing amount of specific, tangible questions that we receive from ambitious companies from the UK. I'm glad that thanks to our partners today and a very attentive audience, we delivered behind this objective. The positive comments in the chat just reflect just that. So let me say again, thanks to Roger and colleagues from Barton LLP, Mary-Kate and Rick from Brand Pi for your presentations today and for supporting the program. We really appreciate your support. Thanks to Kate, Nicolina, and everyone else from the BAB team who made this program work today. And thanks to the many colleagues across the board who joined us today. There were a number of colleagues who we didn't see on screen, but Philip of Xerum, Chris of House Nameplate, or Henry from 3 Life Prints, who submitted their questions directly to me. Really appreciate your interest and your specific questions in particular that we were able to answer today. As mentioned during the session, feel free to contact our speakers after the event. You have seen the emails in the chat that Kate sent through. But feel free to also get in touch with Kate, Nicolina, me, or anyone else from the BAB team if you wanted to have a personal introduction after the event. In addition to that, feel free to also get in touch with the BAB team if you're interested to speak to us about your US expansion. We are not experts in the fields that were presented today, but we are happy to help guide you based on your questions and where you are in your expansion process as part of our BAB trade clinics. Very happy to do that. So feel free to be in touch. Last thing for me to say is feel free to send us also your feedback, what you thought about today, what do you think we can do differently next time, or anything that you felt was missing. We look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow again for the second part of our workshop. And overall, we are really glad to be at your service. With that, I think we have done, I've done my part. Thanks again to everyone. It was good to see you all. And we look forward to help building your business and to seeing you tomorrow.